Alright, so first off, let me just say that Spider-Man 2 is pretty fucking good. I don't think that should be a big surprise to anyone. The web swinging and combat feel fantastic and are fun as hell, and it has a well written story that kept me engaged right until the end. However, as fun as it is, when compared to the original Spider-Man PS4, Spider-Man 2 is really underwhelming and overall feels like a step down in almost every single way. Now before we really dive into it, I think it's important you get an understanding of why this issue in particular was so frustrating with Spider-Man 2. Ever since the release of the PS5 in 2020, the platform's library has been scarce, to say the least. A lot of people like to joke that PS5 has no games, but it's true. The console holds very few true exclusive games, something that was once a selling point for the PlayStation line of consoles not too long ago. When the console first launched, its first two major titles were Demon's Souls and Spider-Man Miles Morales. Demon's Souls, whilst being a commercial success and a huge hit with both critics and general audiences, was a remake of a PS3 game from 2009, with practically no changes made to gameplay, story, the environment, anything really. And the response from diehard fans of the original were fairly mixed, with many citing that the new environments and enemy designs felt a little generic and undermined the art style of the original. As good as it may have been, I wouldn't know, I haven't played it, it was a game made purely to show off the technical ability of the PS5 whilst banking off the nostalgia of those who were fans of the original. Miles Morales, on the other hand, whilst a brand new game that was also critically acclaimed, was a half sequel, a game that was made purely to expand upon the universe of a pre-existing franchise that wouldn't be an issue plot-wise if people missed it, whilst also putting a heavy emphasis on the technical ability of the PS5. On top of that, the game was also released on PS4, meaning it wasn't really incentivizing anyone to go out and buy a PS5. As good as it was just okay. Again, it only served a menial existence to showcase the power of the newly released console whilst providing Spider-Man PS4 fans with something to chew on until the proper sequel came out. And this trend continued. Returnal, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Gran Turismo 7, these have been some of the few games to be released exclusively on PS5 outside of a PC release at least, and as fun as they may have been, they've really struggled to find long-term success and to be able to leave a mark on the industry. And as for some of the more successful games of this generation, God of War Ragnarok, Elden Ring and Resident Evil 4 Remake are all great games with tremendous critical acclaim, and yet even to this day games like this are still being released on both PS4 and PS5, which is just incentivizing people to stay with their PS4s instead of upgrading. Truly the only reason you might have wanted to buy PS5 up until this point was for the technical capabilities of it, which are pretty minor upgrades on the PS4 all things considered. Sure, the better load times are nice, but as is proven by the recent Last of Us Part 2 remaster, the graphical upgrade over the PS4 is barely noticeable for the most part. And that's why the release of Spider-Man 2 was such a crucial one for Sony. Finally, a game was being released exclusively for the PS5 and nowhere else that had a tremendous amount of hype behind it and was surely to become the system's first huge hit. A must-have title that was available only on the PlayStation 5. But that didn't end up happening, did it? Now personally, Spider-Man PS4 is my favourite game of all time, and that is for a multitude of reasons. The gameplay is incredibly fun and satisfying. The web swinging manages to strike the perfect balance between being simple enough to quickly wrap your head around and being just complicated enough to never get boring. I actually replayed the entirety of Spider-Man PS4 in preparation for Spider-Man 2, and not once did I use the fast travel system in that game just because of how well Insomniac nailed the web swinging. And similarly, the combat system is basic enough to not feel like you're playing a game of fucking Osu, whilst also having enough depth to keep you engaged the entire time. And the story, I mean, don't even get me started on the story, holy shit. Again, Insomniac managed to hit the nail dead fucking center on the head. It is lighthearted and fun, but is also full of emotional moments. All of the characters are perfectly fleshed out and memorable, and feel like actual people as opposed to plot devices that only exist to serve the narrative. Doc Ock is a perfect example of this. He is easily one of the most iconic Spider-Man villains, and because of that, everybody and their dog knew he was going to become a villain the fucking second he came on screen. And despite that, he is such a well-written character that by the time he eventually betrays Peter, it is heartbreaking nonetheless. It's a story about loss, perseverance, and becoming a better person, and in my eyes is easily the definitive Spider-Man story. Even better than all the movies, yeah, I fucking said it. So fuck it, let's start there. One of the biggest issues with Spider-Man 2 is that despite being well written and overall serviceable, the story is at its core just a rehash of the story from the first game. Here, let me give you a quick breakdown of the first game's story. The game opens with a boss fight against a longtime enemy of Spider-Man, who after being defeated says something mysterious that foreshadows the events of the game.
Idiot! I'm the one who kept order in this city! 1 month! In 1 month you'll wish you had me back!
Shortly after, a character is introduced who serves as both Peter's friend and mentor, as well as a new group of enemies led by a dangerous villain that has ties to the villain that was defeated during the opening boss fight. As the game progresses, Spider-Man repeatedly faces off against this new group of enemies, before finally defeating their leader. Meanwhile, both the physical and mental state of Peter's friend deteriorates until they are driven to become a new supervillain who briefly turns New York into an apocalyptic wasteland. Finally, after re-defeating the up until now main villain of the game, Spider-Man faces off against his old friend, ultimately saving New York while stripping his friend of his powers. The game ends ends with the city back to normal and Peter being a changed person after the emotional events of the game. Now, let me break down the story of Spider-Man 2 for you. The game opens with a boss fight against a longtime enemy of Spider-Man who, after being defeated, says something mysterious that foreshadows the events of the game.
You're the ones who are gonna need help when they come for you.
Shortly after, a character is introduced who serves as both Peter's friend and mentor, as well as a new group of enemies led by a dangerous villain that has ties to the villain that was defeated during the opening boss fight. As the game progresses, Spider-Man repeatedly faces off against this new group of enemies before finally defeating their leader. Meanwhile, both the physical and mental state of Peter's friend deteriorates until they are driven to become a new supervillain who briefly turns New York into an apocalyptic wasteland. Finally, after re-defeating the up until now main villain of the game, Spider-Man faces off against his old friend, ultimately saving New York while stripping his friend of his powers. The game ends with the city back to normal and Peter being a changed person after the emotional events of the game. Do you see the problem here? Now granted, Spider-Man 2 does add a few elements which shake things up a bit, such as the subplot with Miles coming to terms with his father's death and forgiving Lee for what he did, as well as the whole section with Peter in the symbiote suit, but it doesn't excuse the fact that the story is deep down just the same fucking thing again, especially considering the fact that this was marketed as the first big PS5 exclusive. Other than like Astro's Playroom, this is one of about 3 games to this day that is entirely exclusive to PS5. Not on PC, not even on PS4, PS5 only, and so the fact that at its core the story is just a rehash of a 5-year-old PS4 game feels even more lazy. On top of that, the game's story has far more flaws than the originals, especially when it comes to the villains. Kraven was severely underdeveloped. The idea of him invading New York and turning into his own personal hunting ground is a cool concept, both in terms of story and gameplay, but in the game they don't really explore his personal backstory and motivations, outside of random audio logs that I guarantee you 99% of players didn't pay any attention to. In concept, he's actually a deeply flawed character, a man sentenced to death by cancer who instead wishes to die a warrior's death like his ancestors before him. But at the same time, he was an abusive father, forcefully pushing family traditions onto his children that ruin their life and ultimately lead to their deaths at his own hand. It's a great dynamic that I really wish Insomniac had gone more in depth with, but instead they end up drip feeding his backstory to you through audio logs, and in the end he kind of ends up being this big angry dude instead of the genuinely threatening villain he really should have been. But the real offender here in terms of bad storytelling is Harry. Now, I've mentioned how he's basically just a rehash of Doc Ock from the first game, but the dynamic between him and Peter is especially underdeveloped and poorly written. In the first game, you see Peter and Dr. Octavius being friends, with Octavius being something of a father figure to Peter. You are in Peter's shoes and witness Otto's kindness and selflessness firsthand, but as the game progresses, Otto's mental state rapidly declines until he is a shell of his former self, which is devastating to both Peter and the player, as again, you know what he was like before. The relationship between the two is explored during the duration of the game. But in Spider-Man 2, Harry just shows up out of nowhere and the two discuss how they were once great friends and reminisce about all the good times they had together. But it's not supposed to be this strange, uncanny thing where we as the audience know something is wrong and believe he might be trying to trick Peter in some way. No, at the start he's supposed to be a genuinely likable character and a nice guy, but instead of showing the audience this, like in the first game, we are instead told this. This doesn't make us immediately like Harry as a character whatsoever, it just makes his character feel incredibly ham-fisted. Oh, also, the final boss against Harry in this game is fucking abysmal. The game has a pretty big problem with its boss fights in general, which I'll get to in a minute, but the gameplay in this fight in particular feels incredibly shallow, and the finale just feels like a slap in the face to the audience. In the first game, you are Peter throughout the whole duration, as that was his game, and as the fight progressed, it gradually got slightly easier and easier, emphasizing Peter's determination to defeat Doc Ock, whilst also making it a satisfying final fight for the player, as he always felt like he had the advantage whilst not making it too easy on you. But in this game, you start fighting Venom as Peter, but halfway through he taps out and instead you fight as Miles, and the ending of the fight isn't you as Peter defeating Venom yourself, which would make sense since Harry is supposed to specifically oppose Peter as a character. Instead, Miles finishes off the actual fight itself, while Peter deals the finishing blow in a fucking cutscene. Again, it just feels like such a huge slap in the face to the audience, considering how well they nailed the final boss in the last game, and is especially frustrating as Miles has pretty much already finished his character arc at this point, whereas Peter hasn't. This should be Peter's moment, not Miles. Moving on, the new combat system, whilst it does add a few new elements to the mix, is again very similar to the originals, and all the changes made feel superficial and unnecessary. The new Venom abilities are fun, but don't feel rewarding as you're not doing anything to regenerate them. You just have to wait out the clock until you can use each move again. The new web gadget system also feels really underdeveloped. In the original, you had 8 web gadgets to choose from, all of which felt useful and unique from one another. You had ones that work best in combat, ones that work best in stealth, as well as ones that would even come in handy during non-combat scenarios. But in Spider-Man 2, there were only 4 web gadgets to choose from, from, all of which are pretty fucking useless. On top of that, they don't really stand out from each other and only come in handy in combat sections. Now, granted, the new Venom abilities are sort of a pseudo replacement for the other 4 gadgets, but again, they're pretty basic and make the combat feel shallow. I mean, overall, these new systems work perfectly fine, they're more than serviceable, but they pale in comparison to how well they nailed it in the first game. Also, I'm not sure if this was just a glitch in my game, but 99% of the time, the web gadgets would just straight up not reload. Like, I'd be in a fight, reaching crazy high combos, and the web gadgets just wouldn't reload at all. Oh, and speaking of glitches, this game is full of them. In my playthrough alone, I experienced a decent handful. Here I got stuck in this chandelier and had to restart the fight. Here the enemies spawned underground and I had to restart the fight. I actually lost count of how many times enemies would get stuck in walls while I was fighting them. In the final cutscene of the game, Miles' suit didn't render and he was just a floating head, and then when I loaded in, he was this little white box, and here this enemy gets crushed by some pipes and melts into the floor. Yep. Now, to be fair, I played this game on release, and I'm sure with how late this video's come out, they're almost all fixed by now. Plus, there have definitely been some games over the past few years that have released in far worse states, but that shouldn't be an excuse. Games like this, Cyberpunk, Fallout 76, the GTA Definitive Trilogy, they're setting an unhealthy precedent of how games should be on launch. Yeah, it definitely would have been frustrating, but I would have vastly preferred this game get delayed a month or two to make sure it's as complete as possible on release compared to how I ended up experiencing the game, especially considering the recent trend of games being buggy on release. Back to the gameplay though, the boss fights are bullshit hard. For all 3 of the Spider-Man games so far, the gameplay has generally been pretty easy. Out of the now hundreds of hours I've sunk into these games, even while playing on the hardest difficulty, I would rarely die. But for some damn reason, in this game, the boss fights felt like they were ripped straight out of Dark Souls. Now, to be fair, for many of the boss fights, I wasn't as leveled up as I could have been had I focused more on my playthrough on side content, but for the most part, I was perfectly fine in normal combat, and I feel like I'd spread my time pretty fairly across both main content and side content. So this really shouldn't have been an issue. The only times I specifically remember getting frustrated at a combat section was when the game would bug out and I'd have to restart because the game softlocked me out of finishing a mission. But then when it came to the boss fights, I felt like fucking Sisyphus with the sheer number of times I had to restart the fights. Now this is for many reasons, such as the bosses having ridiculous amounts of health and just generally feeling like hit sponges for the most part, but even beyond that, this game has some serious issues with the revamped combat system. The first one being that they completely fucked up the focus bar. In the first 2 games, the way the focus bar worked was that at any time you could spend the focus you'd built up during a fight to heal yourself. Focus could be built through dodges, attacks, or even air tricks in free mode. Alternatively, if you're feeling confident, you could save up your focus, and once a bar would be filled up, you could perform a finisher to instantly defeat an enemy. But in this game, they completely fucked the whole thing. Now, not only does it take significantly longer to build up your focus, but you only gain focus through perfect dodges or attacks. And on top of that, you only really start to build a significant amount of focus once you've already reached a decent combo, meaning if you're low in health and focusing on dodging attacks and surviving, the game punishes you for not being ballsy and going in for attacks. And the cherry on top of this shit-stained ice cream is the fact that now you can only heal yourself once you've reached a full focus bar. This is obviously incredibly frustrating, as it's not uncommon to be low in health in certain boss fights. In situations like this, your only real options are either going for attacks and be at an extreme risk of dying and having to restart, or focusing on dodging the enemy's attacks and only really going in for the occasional hit, which not only causes you to build very little focus as you won't have a very high combo, but can take several minutes to build your health back up to a point where you're safe to continue fighting the boss as normal. This isn't a fun and worthy upgrade to the bosses of the previous 2 games, it's just annoying and only leads to frustration. But that's not the only aspect of the new combat system that's incredibly infuriating. The new parrying system is also complete horseshit. Here, let me break this down for you. Over the past 2 games, the only option for evading enemy attacks was to dodge them. You could either hit the circle button as soon as you see these little white lines appear above Spider-Man's head, as successfully evade the oncoming attack whilst building a little focus in the process, or you could wait and attempt a far more risky perfect dodge, which would not only build up more focus, but also temporarily prevent that enemy from attacking you for a few seconds. It was an incredibly well-designed risk-reward system that rewarded the player for testing their skills and waiting to dodge attacks. And whilst this system is still around in Spider-Man 2, there is a slimy new addition to it that only proves to be incredibly frustrating. Now, not only can you attempt to dodge or perfect dodge, but you can also parry an attack, allowing you to immediately attack an enemy back after parrying them. Now, this sounds good on paper, it's basically just a better version of a perfect dodge, right? No, if you decide to parry an attack, you can either hold the left bumper to block the attack, leaving you vulnerable to attacks from behind, or you can wait to the last second to parry the attack, allowing you to attack the enemy right back. Again, this sounds good on paper, but if you parry an attack and then accidentally move or are forced to dodge out of the way because of another attack, guess what? You've just missed your window of opportunity to attack that enemy. If you had instead done a perfect dodge, they would still be inhibited and you could go over and attack them, but because you've done a parry move, they're just back to normal. Also, if you're being bombarded by enemies, there's no way you can just spam the left bumper to escape the attacks, unlike with dodging, which again, just shows how vastly superior it is to dodge instead of parry. Okay, but what's the big deal, right? Just keep dodging and you'll be fine. But no, not even that is a way around this broken system, because now there are enemies that will do specific attacks that are either dodge only or parry only. And again, this sounds good on paper, but the execution just falls flat. At this point, the dodging system is most likely just the default for everyone, at least it was for me. Again, the dodging system just works way better and is way more reliable than the parry system, so when a parry attack would come, your immediate reaction would most likely be to hit the dodge button, but by the time you've realized your mistake, it's too late to do anything about it. And yeah, the argument could definitely be made that that's just a skill issue on my part and I should have put more effort into learning the parry system, but outside of this specific scenario, there just isn't a sufficient enough reason to familiarize yourself with it. And with the fast-paced nature of the combat in this game, most of the time, there just isn't enough time to process an oncoming attack and decide whether or not your best option is to dodge or you're going to be forced to parry. And the worst part about all of this is that if you accidentally dodge a parry in the attack, there's no going back. They manage to take just long enough to hit you that you can realize your mistake and try to fix it, but are just quick enough at the same time that there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You're forced to just sit there and wait for the attack to land. Alright, I think I have ranted more than enough about the game at this point. You get the idea. But even beyond all these extremely frustrating issues, the main problem with the game is that it's just safe. It doesn't innovate over the previous titles, it just does the same thing, but takes a few steps back while doing it. Almost all of the differences between Spider-Man 1 and 2 just feel like change for the sake of change. Also, I really want to reiterate that I actually really liked Spider-Man 2. Yeah, I'm sure at this point it sounds like I'd rather take a colonoscopy than replay through it, but it is a good game. It's just that all of the best features it exhibits were already present in the first game, whereas all of its worst aspects are new additions. Look, if I were to give these two games ratings out of 10, being completely objective, I would honestly give the first game a 9 out of 10. Yes, I have repeatedly stated that it's my favorite game of all time, and that holds true even to this day, but admittedly, it does have a couple of minor issues, I'm willing to admit that. Some of the side content can feel a little basic and lacking, and having to grind out over 100 crimes for the platinum gets old fast. Oh, and to be fair, the suits aren't all that great. Insomniac have really stepped up their suit game since the first Spider-Man PS4. Hell, even the DLC suits for the first game are more interesting than 99% of the suits in the base game. But even though it has some minor issues, it still managed to be an incredible game that has left a long-lasting impact on me ever since I first played it back in 2019. And at the end of the day, that is what ultimately makes Spider-Man 2 so frustrating to me. There was room for improvement over the first game, but instead of doing so, it just feels like Insomniac took the easy way out and didn't really innovate over the first game whatsoever. Hell, I haven't even touched on the new face models in this video, which yeah, I understand that Insomniac faced some issues with the new motion capture software they're working with for the PS5, which is the reason they had to change so many of them in the first place, but I refuse to believe there was absolutely no way they couldn't have made the original face models work. I mean, for fuck's sakes, modders have done a great job getting the original face models into Spider-Man Remastered, so I'm sure with just a little bit of effort, Insomniac could have worked around the issues. But instead, they played it safe and took the easy way out. For me, Spider-Man 2 gets a 7 out of 10. Yeah, again, I know at this point it probably sounds like I despise this game to no end, but it is a good game. It's just frustrating that after 5 years of development, it's ultimately just a half-baked rehash of the first game that does very little to improve over its core mechanics, and only really changes anything for the sake of change. But anyways, that's about it. Thank you all so much for watching. Eat your breakfast, and have a good one.